Welcome back. This is the Ben Shapiro Show, talking Impeachment Gate 2019. Joining us on the line to discuss is Tom Jipping. He's a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation, deputy director of the Edwin Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, and a senior legal fellow at the center. Tom, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So what is the point of all of this? I mean, it's pretty obvious that the House Democrats intend fully on impeaching the president. It's just as obvious that the Senate Republicans are not going to vote to convict. So what exactly would Democrats have to establish in these hearings in order to achieve what you think would amount to an impeachable offense?
Well, since Democrats know that they won't remove the president, that's not their objective. The objective is to make him as sort of distasteful to the American public going into the election as possible. So, and since the votes are already there to impeach, it almost doesn't matter what they talk about in these hearings or what the articles of impeachment actually say. We won't know that until the Judiciary Committee approves them. But the fix is in, and they're going to vote articles of impeachment. They could be blank for all the Democrats care. They just want the president to be an impeached president going into the election.
Well, let's talk for a second about the claims that they are now making. So they've shifted from quid pro quo language to bribery language, suggesting that the president has bribed Ukraine to accomplish something. They're not really clear on what it is that Trump was bribing the Ukrainians to do. Number one, Ukraine hasn't provided any of the things that Trump supposedly wanted. And number two, it's not really clear what Trump wanted. I guess them to supposedly open an investigation into Joe Biden. But let's say that you were going to try and make a bribery case against the president, because we're trying to sort of examine how the president can defend himself from these charges and what Democrats are even going to try to claim. Let's say that you were trying to create a bribery case against the president. What elements would you want to seek in order to achieve that?
Well, what they're trying to pin down is that the president, his official action was the provision of military assistance for Ukraine, and the benefit that he would receive from that was the investigation of the Bidens in a way that would help his political aspirations next year. But there's no evidence that he did that. I mean, they were talking about investigating something related to the Bidens about the 2016 election, not the 2020 election. And virtually anything that a president does either helps or hurts in some, intangible way his prospects for re-election. So they call it bribery instead of quid pro quo because, first of all, that's a Latin phrase and no one talks Latin. But they call it bribery because that sounds worse, but it's the same thing. It's, you could read what the president sought, and he, in the course of his official duties as president, provided military assistance and said, to get this, I want you to investigate corruption. You can call it bribery if you want, but that doesn't make it so. And life is full of quid pro quos, so is foreign policy. Mick Mulvaney was right that this is the way government operates all the time. There's no smoking gun that he said, I want you to investigate my rival or you're not going to get this aid. It's just not there. At least we haven't seen it so far.
We're seeing Tom Jipping. He's senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. So, Tom, one of the things I've been claiming here is that it's a mistake for the president to keep going around and saying the call was perfect, everything was perfect, and anybody who says otherwise is a fool, because that's setting up a standard that's simply too high for the evidence to bear. In other words, it appears that the president was not acting particularly great on that phone call, that the president doesn't know the niceties of foreign policy. He doesn't know the niceties of many things, it turns out, and that basically the best defense here is that Trump has a lot of ideas about stuff that went on in 2016. Some of those ideas are well substantiated, like the Ukrainians coordinating with the Hillary Clinton campaign, and some of those ideas are completely not substantiated, like Hillary Clinton's server being hidden in a forest in Kiev somewhere. And then he sort of wrapped those all up in a ball and said, Ukraine doesn't get its aid until it investigates all the things I want investigated. And that really didn't have anything to do with 2020. It had to do with him being ticked off over 2016. And thus, the requisite motive is just not there for quote-unquote bribery, because the bribery offense would have to attach to presumably some benefit that he garners for 2020, specifically to have a foreign power investigated domestic political rival for purposes of forward-looking elections. That seems like the strongest defense. It seems like that's the defense that Republicans are coming around to. Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana seemed to center in on this when he said that the question really here is going to be motive.
I hope that that's what they do, and I agree with you completely on that point. First of all, this is not a transcript. That document, which everybody can look at, says on the bottom of the first page, this is not a transcript. It's a memo about the phone call derived from people's recollections. Even in today's hearing, we've noted how different people who listened to that phone call had different impressions about a couple of points. So to say that it was perfect and all of that is a huge mistake. The fact is, you can read that memo about the call. You could even, if you could get your hands on an actual transcript, you can read it different ways. And the question at the end of the day is, should we nullify the last election and remove the president over some statements that can legitimately be read different ways? The answer to that question is no.
Well, let's talk for a second about the kind of process that the Democrats are using here. So they've claimed this is the same impeachment process that they've used before. And the witnesses that they're calling, they seem to think are damning witnesses. The only witnesses, it seems to me, who should matter in this particular inquiry are not people like Bill Taylor or people like Kurt Volker. The people who really should matter in the end are the people who have firsthand knowledge of stuff that Trump has directly said. Not just on that phone call, where we can all read the sort of memo, which even according to Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who really doesn't like the president, is pretty reflective of the content of the call. But people who actually have a window into the motivations of President Trump, meaning Rudy Giuliani, Mick Mulvaney, Gordon Sondland, the EU ambassador. I'm sort of bewildered why the media are paying all this attention to Bill Taylor and George Kent today, when both of them admit they've never had a conversation with the president of the United States, and neither of them, as far as I'm aware, was even on the phone call in question.
Yeah, but remember, at the end of the day, articles of impeachment against Donald Trump don't have to have anything to do with that phone call. I mean, that is where all the attention is focused, but there's no requirement that the articles that the Judiciary Committee finally produces have to be limited to what was said or not said on that phone call. So, I mean, Democrats are casting a little bit wider net than that and having a little bit broader narrative than that. But I got to tell you, if normal people across the country are watching this hearing and they're hearing these long discussions about Ukraine foreign policy and all of that kind of stuff, interest is going to wane pretty quickly, and the connection between that and why the president should be removed is not going to be obvious to anybody. But I agree with you that that's why I think the whistleblower should testify. And we've seen today why Democrats have set up this process the way they have. Unlike past impeachments, Republicans have to get Democrats' permission to subpoena anybody. And one of the first questions I was asked this morning was, when is the whistleblower going to testify? We've asked it to be subpoenaed. And Schiff said, you'll be able to make a motion to that so the committee can decide that. And, of course, which way do you think the committee's going to go?
Well, the guest is Tom Jipping, Senior Legal Fellow at Heritage Foundation. Tom, thanks so much for your insight. Really appreciate your time. And I'm sure we'll check back in as this process